my own teaching and perhaps with Dr. Hennick's teaching, we all love to be on time. So I think we will have this session underway now. Hey, my name is Samson. I am from the Department of Social Work and Social Administration. I have the responsibility for this semester to coordinate the seminar meeting. So pretty much I am here today to facilitate the discussion. As we advertise on the program, the sort of first 1.5 hours till 2 o'clock will be very much a seminar, a lecture presented by Dr. Hennick. And after the break, for those who have questions, issues you want to further discuss with the speaker, we have engaged or book Dr. Hennick section till 3:30. So I would really encourage you to make use of the time and to see how the discussion may extend, may add value to your work. Well, I'd just like to introduce Dr. Hennick very briefly. He is very much interested in not only medical psychology, psychopathology, but also very much medical history and also philosophy as well. It has been a long time we communicate to have this event taking place. It took us almost 3 months to organize everything, so I'm so glad to welcome Dr. Hennick in person today. Without further ado, I just pass the time to you.
Thank you so much for this welcome. Much appreciated, and thank you for coming. I would like to thank Professor Jen, first of all, who is in absence here, and indeed Dr. Tse in particular for having arranged all this. It's been a real pleasure collaborating with you, I have to say this publicly here. And I hope we can maybe continue along these lines in the future as well. Anna Lau, is she here? Miss Lau, Anna?
Not yet.
So I think you're two in absentia then, because that's also very helpful. We're about to embark on a... Oh, before I forget, no recording, please. I keep forgetting this. I prefer not to have recordings done to my lecture, please, if you wouldn't mind before we begin. Thank you very much for respecting that. It's a principle. We're going to be embarking about into an excursion of a wide field within a limited amount of time. And let me start by reflecting upon the earliest recollections that we have in the field of medicine, and these are the old Egyptians. The old Egyptians had, there is a monograph depicting suicidal ideation. Somebody talking about his bar, sort of a monologue talking about himself, obviously we would say depressed, suicidal ideation. Also we there find the very first texts regarding severe toothache pain. You know, toothache can be a very, very severe condition to the root, and so the old Egyptians first described that. But let us start here, closer to home, very, very superficially. Just find this page down. It doesn't work. Would you... Oh, here we go. Sorry. Now I found it. It doesn't react now. Would somebody please be able to help me here? Okay? We're somewhere totally elsewhere now. Just go back to the start. We're the wrong... No, we're totally wrong here. Could we just close this and go back to the start? Totally wrong. I'm going to close this and restart. Sorry for this mishap. We're going to go into slide 2. Oh, I'm sorry. That's it. Thanks very much. And now you try it. See what it works. Oh, now it works.
Yeah, you
so
go to end. Yeah.
You go to end, not to page down.
No. You go to page down.
Page down. That's what I did before.
Okay.
We call this is a good example of psychology. We'll call this the Midas touch. I do the thing, and another person does it, but the other person is the expert, Dr. Sir, and it works. It happens all the time. Happens all the time. So that's the famous Midas touch. Okay, so closer to home, here we start. And I wish I had the Hans. I don't, and hopefully one day I can put it into Hans for you. Okay, so very, very briefly, those are the earliest Chinese recollections. We call that the medical theoretical traditions. Some of which you may be familiar, some less, so that's very earliest. And I won't go into this because it's just an example. Okay. Is there anybody familiar with any of these names? Or is the transcription so poor that you can't even recognize it? Okay. 没有问题，我们继续，我继续，好不好？我继续。OK， 好的。然后这是什么地方呢？Here you see a bit of a comparison. Okay, you see here Tianshi, Han Dynasty, I think, and the Chinese representation, and the Caucasian, which is of course Greek description. And the most famous one that you're all familiar with is Hippocrates. So this is where Western medicine all started, with Hippocrates. And here we've got Bianchi, and we've got this gentleman by the name of Sima. Okay, now he's the first Chinese historian to describe medicine, apparently. Okay. Now let's talk about Hippocrates. He is from Kos. That means, in Greek, the island of Kos. Incidentally, you can still visit the island now. They still have a lot of a museum there, a little place to remember him. I've never been there myself, I have to say, but I learned that there you can still visit the island of Kos, which is one of those many Greek islands. Okay? And what always intrigued me when I teach this, Hippius in Greek means horse. Hippius. And you know what Ma means in Chinese? Sima. Ma is horse. So whether it's a coincidence, I always find it intriguing that the two sort of pioneers or the two early writers, I mean, he was a historian, of course. Hippocrates was the sort of the first medical himself, are associated to horses. Okay. 继续. There are some similarities between the practice in the West and the practice in China. This is derived from Latin. The tongue diagnosis in Greek is called diagnostics. Recognize I put it into Latinized words here. And you see in a moment, I'll give you the picture to that. Okay? That's just a description. Here we see, on the right side, Chinese practice, the pulse diagnosis, incidentally, actually more precise than the Western one, I might say. There's two fingers. And the tongue diagnosis. And you look at this. This will be ojo. 这是中国的，这是 ojo 的。好不好？ Pulse taking, pulse. Notice. Okay. 继续。有问题吗？还没有啊？
I mean, were the underlying, I mean, certainly there's this, on the surface there's this parallel and similarity, but what about the underlying understanding of pathology or anatomy? Were there any kind of parallel underlying behaviors or diagnostic tools?
Frankly, about the Chinese medicine, I am not competent enough to tell you. The Europeans, they developed certain schools. They were in Italy at a very early stage, in places in northern Italy, in Belgium, what's called Belgium now, and certain other places. And they were quite international. So the Italians would call Harvey from Scotland, you know, for example, and they would teach. But I think this has developed independently. I don't know whether there was a lot of interaction going on then. I frankly wouldn't know. But I think that those were independently developed. So I wouldn't be in a position to say one borrowed from the other. I'll give you another example. Urine examination was at one time very popular. So we run into fashions, you know. So there is a fashion, if I may say so, to do this. Scientifically would say it's a paradigm shift, you know, that we do this and that. And that, I would say, holds true for any place, whether it's Europe, China, or India, or for that matter. And I say this on purpose with reference to today, because there's a caveat here. We shouldn't think this is all the past. We're still doing this today. I mean, who knows what people are going to say about medicine today in 40 years from now? I'm not going to be there in 40, 50 years. What are people going to say then about our medicine today? So this is why I felt history of medicine quite relevant for today as well. Okay, but here is an example from the Arab world. We're not just talking about Caucasians or Khmer or Japanese for that matter. There is one famous, this is an example, a Persian actually. And I'll give you the Arab transcriptions here. And in Latin, this gentleman is called Avicenna. Avicenna was kind of a polyhistor, or polymath, as they sometimes say in England as well. A person that wrote about just about everything, including medicine. So medicine was just one of his writings. Okay? And canon of medicine, in Arab this is called kitab, this book of medicine. He provided an overview of various aspects of medicine according to the principles of Galen. Anybody familiar with Galen here? Galenius? Nobody? Well, Galenius was the earliest, you asked that question, was the earliest, apart from Hippocrates, which is sort of the very first. But Galenius really wrote the first textbooks. Galenius. Okay? So it's a very, in terms of history, early history of medicine, you can't escape Galen because it's a very important person. Galenius in Latin. Okay? So it's said that he also may have influenced, although I'm not sure, Albertus Magnus, which was also a very, very influential person in Ojo. Okay? So, all right. And also, arguably, he was one of the earliest attributed to have described the melancholia in his famous book. Okay. Now we begin with the history. So this was the preliminary about the history of medicine in general, just a very superficial overview, okay, to see in the context. Now we are zeroing into the history of psychiatry. And I begin with the very initial processes within the history of psychiatry. So far we've been talking about the entire history of medicine, of which the psyche, of course, is also part. Psychosomatics. So usually this is associated with Pinel in France, and he started to write the traité médico-philosophique sur l'aliénation mentale. So that's his first œuvre, his writing. About the same time, there was another gentleman by the name of Esquirol who plays an important role in the history of medicine. He uses the expression aliénation, excuse-moi, Mental et folie. Folie, the French word for folie is the madness. What we say in English is madness. Alienation is the, we have the English word alien, aliens. You know, the aliens, the English word aliens is the same etymological root as in French alienation. Okay, the same root etymologically speaking. Okay, so seldom he used the maladie mentale. Maladie mentale en français, ça veut dire que in French that means the illness, the mental illness. Okay, maladie is the illness. Okay. Now this needs to be compared to the German Seelenstörungen, which developed at the same time in Germany. So basically, in Ojo, which is usually associated with the history of psychiatry to be at the very beginning, there are basically two early lines. One is the French one, and one is the German one. Okay. So now I'm going to talk about the German one, because that Seelenstörung is about the equivalent to the French, developed at the same time independently. Okay. This was developed by Heinroth. Now Heinroth was practically, as you can see, 73, I'm sorry. He was really the earliest who can talk about mental treatment at the very, very, very beginning. Okay? Okay? Psychiatry at that time didn't exist as a discipline. They were called psychica. They used a different name. They didn't use the term neurology of psychiatry at that stage yet. Okay? As you can read, I translated that into English, that we should not look at the details, but focus on the entire human life in all its relationships. The single person is nothing without the whole, which in turn is nothing with the binding idea, this is my translation. All right? So what Heinroth is doing, he's focusing on the biography. On the biography. So he's looking at the biography. He's looking at the whole person, at the biography of the person. There was no mental classifications back then. Okay? This is a romantic, we call this the romantic period. So this is a romantic depiction. All right? Let me just, where is my sticker? A romantic depiction of the very first, arguably the very, very first asylum back in 1757. Okay? This is a 1804 it says here, right, sorry. In Germany. If you translate this, this is his first textbook. The textbook is called The Störungen des Seelenlebens, and in which Heinrich, who occupied the first chair for psychic therapy, as I mentioned before, it was not psychiatry yet, so it was called sort of psychic therapy, in 1811. And he perceived disorders to be caused by the soul itself. So the patient, by the soul itself, and the patient biography is considered. This means that he looked at the moral issues. In other words, there were religious undertones, very much consistent with the time, and he looked at moral issues as well. So he looked at the biography of a person and said, well, how is the life of this person and the person, and then certain conditions could be explained in terms of biography. See? So this is how it started. And please just take this as a picture, as a romantic picture. We call this the romantic period, because surely it was not very romantic back then. Okay? So this is a very, very, very early pre-scientific stage we're talking about. And where I'm leading it gradually and very superficially to the modern times, actually. Okay, here we go, Heinroth again. Conscience, and this is very interesting. he talks about, he's German, talks about über uns. And you compare that with the Freud über ich, the superego. I mean, Freud was much, much later, bear in mind. But the concept of über ich was first mentioned in Heinrich, much earlier. It's interesting, it's sort of intriguing. And also, Heinrich was attributed for having used the term psychosomatics. Now, in the history of psychiatry, you find several authors claiming to have used the term psychosomatics for the first time. So it's very difficult to establish who actually used that term. 沒有問題這個，沒有問題。因為這個 psycho 這個一個 Greek 理想 the etymology is Greek, you know, psycho, psyche. And soma means the body. So it's actually a Greek compound. Psyche in Greek, and soma in Greek means soul body. That's what it means, psychosomatics. Okay? So it's a Greek compound. Okay? Anyway, here on page 49, he talks about sleeplessness. You know? So usually the sources of sleeplessness are psychosomatic. So quite possibly he was the first person who may have used this term. Now, not so, oh, sorry. This is very sensitive stuff. Here we go. Not surprisingly, we are talking about, sooner or later, about the famous or infamous dichotomy. The dichotomy between psychogenesis and somatogenesis. Okay? Which is with us more or less still today. This dichotomy prevails in scientific discourse ever since, more or less. People I've mentioned here in this presentation today, because I have a separate presentation on special issues, is Möbius, for example, or Virchow, complete representative of somatogenesis, denying the psychogenesis in their works, in their early works. Okay? Now, here you've got the aforementioned Heinrich and a gentleman by the name of Ideler, another German apparently, Ideler, which I didn't write down here because otherwise he would get more and more and more and it would just be overburdened with names, I suppose. So Ideler and Heinrich were proponents of which side? They were proponents of psychogenesis, quite clearly. Okay? And I'm just going to introduce the persons who are, or already did partially these two, and I'm going to introduce the next one here in a moment, the somatogenesis. Okay? So you've got Ryan and Escarole on the somatogenesis side, Heinrich and Ideler as examples of the psychogenesis side. And then you've got a gentleman by the name of Griesinger, who actually is the proponent, as we'll see in a moment, of this school, if we called it school at that time, but quite aware of this as well. So let's talk about this important Griesinger for a few minutes. Oh, before I do so, diagnostics versus interpretation. Yeah, that stays with us too. Diagnostics versus interpretation. Natural science versus psychogenetics. Yeah. So again, you've got natural science and somatogenesis. Okay? And sort of crosswise. Okay? This Professor Griesinger deserves attention because arguably he has been the first to introduce science into the beginning field of psychiatry. All right? He is a German, So, Pathologie und Therapie der psychischen Krankheiten was the title of his textbook, which translates into Pathology and Therapy of Psychic Illnesses. And as I mentioned before, he combines localized brain disorder with psychology, and he may have done so for the first time on a scientific basis. I mean, relatively speaking. So as I said, he initiated psychiatry. One might say it was him who initiated psychiatry as a university discipline. The first journals would emerge. Heinrich, there were no journals yet. You know, it was a romantic, what we call the romantic period, you know, philosophical. And contrary to Heinrich in Italy, as I mentioned before, in 1835, he postulated to recognize psychological disorders as disorders of the brain. So this is the famous somatogenesis. Okay? In other words, what Griesinger did, he did not attribute psychiatric disorder to, shall we say, biography or moral values. So he disassociated this while respecting it, while respecting the psychogenesis. He didn't dismiss all that, but his focus was definitely on the somatogenesis and not on this, was Heinrich still religiously dominated, biographically dominated discourse. You can call it discourse at that time. Notice that he also created the term structure of the ego, and the Ich-Struktur does not only play a role in Freud. In the scientific research of psychosis, in the European tradition, the ego structure plays an eminent role. So there's a lot of eminent literature on the I structure, the ego structure. It starts, if you will, with Griesinger to a small extent. Okay? And this is not necessarily related to Freud. Freud, who would come later, and who then developed a whole building, if you may say so, a whole construction, or for lack of a better word, a construct. It is a construct, Freud and psychoanalysis. Okay? The Ich-Struktur plays a role even today in our discussion about psychosis and unrelated to Freud. Then the wish fulfillment, something which we find in Freud, of course. The onset of frustration we find in Freud much later. You find that in Griesinger. Now, I'm not saying that Freud was an adept. Actually, I don't know. I don't know. I couldn't really tell. But what I can tell is that Griesinger has already used these terms that we find in psychoanalysis later. I mean, in Freud's writing. Okay? Very interesting, I thought, from a historical perspective. And bear in mind, 1845, at a very, very early stage, comparatively speaking. Okay, here is a tribute to him. He did not avoid getting involved with the principal epistemological issues of psychiatry, which were an unpopular topic in his time as well, but discussed them intensively and with a constant look at their relevance for clinical and research purposes. That's exactly, I think, describing Griesinger in a nutshell quite well. I'm going back to the French. Or do you want me to go back to the old slide if you still want to read? Okay? I'm just going to show you a depiction, and this is sort of the entrée Charcot. We're moving on in time. I'm staying sort of roughly at the same time. The presentation were made according to drawings by Paul Richer for the chapter Les démoniaques convulsionnaires. C'est pas une faute là, ici, je sais pas. D'aujourd'hui. The 19th century motoric manifestation of hysteria can hardly be observed today. We'll see in a moment, otherwise it wouldn't make sense to me. So this is the book. This is the depiction that I just introduced to you. What you see here is, in this book of art, as it is explained in French, you see from Charcot, which Freud would have also been very familiar with, because he went to Paris. Freud, as a young man, went to Paris to study with Charcot. These things you'd hardly see today in the West. At least these phenomena, like it's called the Grand Acte. The Grand Acte. But in those days, yes. Especially you wouldn't see it in university hospitals. You may go to some very rural places, but the university hospitals at the university hospital in the West, I've never seen this. Maybe once, maybe not. But at other places, very rarely. Okay? So this is a le démoniaque dans l'art. Le démoniaque dans l'art. Demons in the art. Okay, we can continue with our very cursory, superficial description of the history of psychiatry, the history of psychopathology. I will move to the year of 1863 now. 1863, a gentleman by the name of Carl Baum actually, for the first time ever, wrote or composed, recognizing there's a need for it, a first systematic psychopathology. So he thought there's a need to do this, and so this gentleman who also describes catatonia, he wrote on psychopathology in terms of an effort to have a methodological descriptions which would actually even include some ethnic aspects. So that was Carl Baum. But it was actually a very small beginning. It's just the beginning. Okay? Then you've got the famous Wernicke, 740, the aphasic symptom complex. This is German, aphasische Symptomenkomplexe, the aphasic symptom complex. And then we've got the very famous, and I'm sure you're all familiar with Kraepelin, are you? Okay, and then 1883, I mean, at that time, Kraepelin begins to dominate the scene. Kraepelin was so famous that actually Japanese students went to see him and study. He was at Munich mostly, but not only, there were other places too. And Kraepelin never actually traveled to Japan, but he had lots of Japanese, and their accounts, their descriptions, published descriptions, you can read on, as I've just recently done. People who went to see him as late as the 20s, in other words, before World War I, and shortly after World War I, and some very interesting accounts on Kraepelin. But Kraepelin did actually visit Java. So Java in Indonesia. So and there was also an exchange with Java, and he actually went to see and visit Java himself. Okay? So Kraepelin then develops a classic systematic approach, differentiating dementia precox. That is his terminology. Okay? That was Kraepelin. Paranoia, manic depressive disorder by Scott. All of a sudden, you find Kraepelin introducing these terminologies, which partially we used until recently. Okay? Well, we just call this bipolar now. It's just a name change. You went to Mark? Before I move on, I just wanted to mention one more thing about Griesinger. That Griesinger was actually an amazing person because he introduced for the first time social psychiatry, what we call today social psychiatry. So he had concepts about day clinics, very modern in those days. You know, there were no ambulatory services, day clinics. All these ideas, Griesinger, before Kraepelin, developed. He didn't see it in effect because he died early. He died in the 60s, early. But here we can also associate the term social psychiatry with the gentleman I just introduced a short while ago. And this is what they look like. On the left side, you've got Kraepelin, you know, was the very first beginning of psychopathology. And on the right-hand side, you've got the Griesinger. This was done, this picture is from 1865, I believe, 3 years before he died. So he would have been dead 3 years later on. Yeah, 1865, I double checked here on my notes, which are still right, fortunately. All right. 有问题吗？如果有没有问题，我继续。好的。所以现在我给你一个 what we're going to do now, I give you a small, just a very small introduction to the proponents of schizophrenia. I mentioned one, which is Kraepelin. I'm now going to mention number two. Okay? So it's Kraepelin, and who was number two? You all know. Who was the second one? Kraepelin was this dementia praecox, and who was the other proponent? 没关系，我给你，我们看看一下，好不好？ Here is Kraepelin again, and the other gentleman is Eugene Bleuler. 小心，有两个。This is the elder, and there is also younger. Okay? And Bleuler then talked about the group later. Bleuler talked about group of schizophrenias. Okay? So first Kraepelin started with the dementia praecox concept, and then Bleuler comes along and says, we'll do this differently. You've got to imagine Kraepelin was at a different location. Bleuler was Swiss, so he worked out of Zurich in Switzerland, and was quite independent to be far away from Munich and from the other places where Kraepelin used to visit. Okay, and just to give you an idea, a bit of a background, Bleuler had one well-known person, many well-known persons, but one that you all know, namely Jung, worked at his clinic. So that's just, Jung was still a very young man at that time, a little later than that. So just to give you a sort of idea. Of course, Kraepelin would have had a school of scholars at his university, clinic. 你好，欢迎我的上课，欢迎。 Okay, this is what they look like. On the left side, Kraepelin. So you see, Bleuler survived Kraepelin by quite a few years. And Bleuler, incidentally, lived, I don't know about Kraepelin, but also Kraepelin moved. In his early years, he lived quite elsewhere. But Bleuler actually lived at the clinic. You know, his family, he had a family, and they lived, you know, at the first floor or something, at a nice apartment, at the large hospital. And by the way, Griesinger was supposed to be one of the directors, and he declined. And it was around 65 when that photo was taken. He declined, and then I think he decided to go to Berlin instead. And it didn't do him very good because he died 3 years later on. He would have done a lot of good work, but that's it. It's that's just a bit of information on the side. Right. I probably have seen these pictures before. Although they're not very common. Have you seen these pictures before? Probably not. Yeah, because they're not very common. See, people in those days also didn't want to take, be recorded. But there was no methodology to do that. But today you really have to point this out. All right, Chichi. Kraepelin's disease concept is pathological anatomy, a proper etiology, and what he calls the natürliche Krankheitseinheiten, natural disease entities.我跟你这个就是对的翻译，好不好？就是对的翻译了，the natural disease entities. Okay? So once again, to recapitulate, he established psychiatry as a clinical discipline. One might say, leaving Griesinger aside, it was Kraepelin incentives for research. That's certainly the case. He had research funds and he had a large staff around him. And as I mentioned before he even had a number of Japanese students going there again and again and again. So he would have had visitors for years from Japan. The Japanese took a great interest in his work. This was a time when we had the large hospitals in the countryside. That's when it started more, in the Kraepelin's time. You know, those large compounds that we're nowadays sort of trying to make smaller, or in Canada and other places dissolve partially, and which creates new problems, but that's a different issue. It's fair to say that Kraepelin had a profound impact on psychiatric diagnosis. As opposed to Kraepelin, his contemporary Bleuler, Eugene Bleuler. That's the Bleuler the elder. Okay? Here's a bit of a description, because 2008 marks the anniversary. You've got to read yourself if you like. You see, Bleuler talks about the group of illnesses, die Gruppe der Schizophrenie. That's Bleuler's term. That's Bleuler's term. Kraepelin wouldn't use that initially. And this group of illness would be a historical milestone for some, and in heading into new directions. And what are these associations that Bleuler is talking about? It's the affect, the ambivalence, autism, and associations. Autism was very, very popular in those days. I mean, if you look at the old case histories at the clinic, autism was talked about a lot. And if you look at modern writing, if you don't mind me saying this, autism is, again, much talked about. So it runs into fashions, maybe. Right now we do a lot of autism research. You know, fMR research, you know, one after the other, you know, very popular. In the old case histories of Bleuler, you'd find the term autism quite frequently. This is what the book looked like. Dementia praecox oder Gruppe der Schizophrenie. Higher group of schizophrenia. Okay? And you see here in this book, a later edition, his son was already involved, Dr. Archie. 这个打着 R 字的怎么说的树。对。马上我给你这个翻译，好不好？还有这个 Benedetti， 就是也有意思。我认识。From Eugen Spleuer's paper in the annual meeting of the German Society of Psychiatry in Berlin back in 1908. This is the translation. The following was said. In the interest of the discussion, I would like to emphasize again that Kraepelin's dementia praecox does neither necessarily represent a dementia nor necessarily praecogitas. For this reason, and because the expression dementia praecox does not permit derivatives of adjectives and nouns, I allow myself here to use the word schizophrenia. Now that's an important text. That's what Bleuler suggested in 1908. And notice, very interestingly, the remark about linguistics. So he says, actually, it's not a very practical term. Not only because it's not necessarily dementia, we don't know, we really don't know. But the term is not very practical. The term is not very practical. You can't make derivatives from it. You can't derive something from this word. Interesting, isn't it? So, a certain amount of linguistic pragmatism also plays a role. But that's only a side role. All right? 我们继续。你们看不看？好不好？ For description, okay, it reads like this. I allow myself here to use the word schizophrenia for the description of Kraepelin's notion. I believe, namely, or I namely believe, that's how you want to translate this, that the rupture or splitting of psychic functions would constitute an outstanding symptom for the entire group. End of quote. It's Bleuler's way. I believe, specifically, I namely believe that the rupture or splitting of psychic function would constitute an outstanding symptom for the entire group. Now, 你们是中国人啊，这个外国人呢。这个如果你知道这个 schizophrenia, that is in Greek is a splitting. That is a splitting. The white man are more familiar with Greek terms, but it's splitting. The schizo, it's a sort of very often in medicine the Greek terms are used and then the Latin one is spread. Quite a lot of Greek terms actually. So that's where it came about, was that term. All right, and so that's back in 1908. And so, eventually, Bleuler's term was adapted. And dementia praecox terminology sort of became historical. Right? Okay, conclusions. D. Bleuler postulated a neurological etiology of the group of schizophrenias, but as opposed to Kraepelin, was skeptical against defining natural disease entities. Okay? Because that's clear. So he was still focused on neurobiology. What was called neurobiology in 1908. 就是说，第二 Bleuler's concept of schizophrenia with its multi-dimensional approach. You see, again with Bleuler, multi-dimensional approach. We had that multi-dimensional approach before with Griesinger in a different context. Here in the context of schizophrenia. And he's differentiated psychopathology, long-term follow-up perspective, as well as acceptance of naturalistic hermeneutic and social elements, they have been relatively less at risk of dogmatization than the consequence. That is, one might argue this way, in favor of Bloiler at the time, back in 1908. If you compare the two, you might argue this way, that it is less at risk of dogmatization to this Bloiler. Au revoir. Okay. Qui-san? Yeah, it's very interesting. Where do we find the association psychology? You know? You do know. What? Do you know the association psychology? That's a psychological term. I mean, wouldn't. So these are terms borrowed from psychology. Okay. Now let us now conclude this little excursion into schizophrenia and reflect upon the personality traits in general. Just a little break, if you will, before we continue on with our little superficial excursion. The personality in physical representation can be attributed to at least 4 types. Is there anybody who's not familiar with this? Are you all familiar with these? Not familiar? These are classic types, and you can trace them down more or less Zoyo from Aristotle. And here I give Galenius, I mentioned earlier on at the beginning of the lecture. I mentioned that he was a very influential early historian of medicine. Not psychiatry, but medicine as a whole. Bear in mind, they couldn't dissect bodies then. There were no, it was very speculative still. And Kretschmer is 20th century. This is past World War II. So this is a very modern concept. You're not familiar with this? Then I explain to you. This leptosome is not related to schizophrenia. It's schizoid. It's not. It's a term schizoid, but it's not schizophrenia. So that person would not be diagnosed as schizophrenia. According to ICD-10, that's a personality. You can have a personality disorder. Those leptosome means very slim people, tall, slim people typically. All right. And the second one is the opposite. So the short, fat people. Okay? I'm over-generalizing now. I'm just looking at the physical presentation. Okay? And back in Aristotle's time, people thought about, can we draw certain conclusions from the shape of a person? And then, of course, I could go on forever, which I don't in this lecture, about the whole fashion. I won't go into this lecture at all. But there's a fashion of phrenology. There was a fashion where people studied the head function, and then they studied the head in the 19th, 18th century, and they said we can draw conclusions from the form of the head, the skull, But I won't go into this because it's not scientific. This is really something that you ought to know, and those are then associated as sickly, manic depressive. Okay, the overall tendency, just an overall. The number 3, athletic. Now the athletic persons, no need to explain, and they may be associated with sometimes being explosive, okay? Because they've got a lot of energy and maybe a shortage of patience, okay? Possibly. And the infantile is a rare type, not very often. The infantile type, we call this dysplasia. Now the word dys is Greek, and what does this mean? It means 不好. Okay? I means 好, and this means 不好. So我们说这个 dysfunctional, not functional, dysfunctional. So dysplastic. So typically you come across the first three, and this type is not so frequent. And then they're dysplastic. You know, it's actually well described. And I would not be surprised if you have something in China like this. And in Zhongguo, isn't there something similar in the Chinese tradition of medicine? Something similar to this? You must have. Yuma? I would be very surprised if in the long Chinese tradition of medicine there wouldn't be something similar to that. 这是一个问题，如果你不提议，没有吗？ I'm sure there is, but maybe you have to go back a long time maybe you have to read Shima, or I don't know. No, but that's a bit too old. But I would be very surprised if the long Chinese tradition doesn't have something along the line, something similar. Not identical, but something similar. Okay. 有问题吗？我一个问题 but you say there is not to your knowledge.
Don't know.
Because I would be very interested to know, and then I would be able to consider that, and I'd be very interested to know. So if you do, then let me know by email.
I wonder whether we have something like about a person's facial features.
Mm-hmm.
As a thought. I don't know enough.
That's a very modern thought. You see, because that's what we're in now. You see how history goes back? What we're into now is facial recognition. You know,
no,
facial recognition.
I don't mean recognition, but to examine a person's facial features, to be able to predict or suggest a kind of personality.
But that's happening now.
Yeah.
That's what you're saying. No, what you're saying. This is very, very modern now. What you're saying is this is surely happening in forensics. People are trying to find patterns. Yeah. So, but I was wondering about the Chinese history. This is what you're saying is very much up to date. That's the stage we're in now. We will transport this to facial features.
But you may have ancient origin. I'm suggesting. Yeah.
Oh, I can do it this way. 对了吗？好，我继续。We now continue with our history. We're up to 1895. We're almost at the 19th century now. And so here it's about time to mention Freud. Well, I did mention him earlier, but to mention him in the slide specifically. He obviously had an influence in those days on the psychodynamic American psychiatry, and as I mentioned before, there were precursors, as I mentioned earlier, in terms of hypnosis. Psychopathosis again being a Greek word. We mentioned Charcot earlier on, Bernheim, and Janet, which were all French precursors to Freud, and as I also mentioned earlier, Freud actually studied with Charcot. And when he came back to Vienna, he would tell his colleagues about his experiences and so forth. And it certainly had a profound influence, his stay in Paris. That was at the Charité in Paris. Then the famous Pavlov with the conditioned reflexes, as you all know. And then in 1906, Jung publishes his association experiences. These association experiences were actually done in Bloyle's clinic. You know, he was still with Bloyle then, I think, because he then left the clinic, or I won't go into details, but he didn't stay there forever and very long. And the machinery, I think it's still in the museum somewhere. I mean, so as you know, there was a separation with Freud, who had a profound impact on Jung. I suppose it's fair to say it also had an impact on Freud, but it certainly did have on Jung. And then he pursues his so-called analytical psychology, or complex analytical psychology, as opposed to psychoanalysis. So you've got the psychoanalysis, Freudian psychoanalysis, and opposed to analytical psychology. Very interestingly, on the side, the psychoanalysis had many male proponents. If you look in the history of psychoanalysis, you know, the Wednesday circle that Freud had around him, they were practically males. And Jung, who was quite a bit younger than Freud, attracted a number of females. So for one reason or another, whether it was personality or the actual contents of their constructs, because in my humble opinion as a psychopathologist, this is what they are, constructs, in both ways, must have appealed more to females in Jung's case. So Jung had more female followers then. That's just on the side. 1913 to 65 comes the most important person in the history of psychopathology. Now I'm going to introduce very briefly, because I have a separate lecture about Jaspers. I teach Jaspers separately. Jaspers is the very first scientific psychopathologist. Now remember we had a forerunner, Karl, but that was just a minor. Jaspers went about in a very major way and said, you recognize there's a real deficit. There's a deficit out there. We need to, and you recognize the need to write a textbook, you know, a real voluminous textbook on psychopathology for the first time. It took about half a century for this textbook, which is called the Allgemeine Psychopathologie, in English, the General Psychopathology, to translate into English, which is very unfortunate. Why it took so long? Because the book is difficult to read, and you have to find a translator who puts up this, I don't know how many hundred pages that is. It's a pretty voluminous book. And it's unfortunate, because then the British psychiatry for about 50 years was deprived, unless you were able to read German, which very few British psychiatrists could do. You were deprived about this most interesting conclusions and summaries and overviews and analysis that Jaspers provided. So please note, Jaspers, we are now in the midst of the psychopathology. With him, the scientific study of psychopathology really took off. Okay? Kurt Schneider was influenced by him, of course, and his book was much shorter and was a sort of a condensation of his work in a very pragmatic way, and it's called the clinical psychopathology, as opposed to general psychopathology. General psychopathology very wide, the clinical psychology is just a book, which is very influential, by the way, very influential. Influenced the DSM and certainly the ICD. The person named John Jaspers was very interesting. He started out in law for one semester, then went into medicine, and from medicine went into psychology, and he ended up a philosopher. So it's a fascinating person with a wide spectrum, academic spectrum. And he's as recognized in psychiatry as he was in philosophy, which is rare. So then you have, and he didn't found a school, you know, like other people did. He was quite independent. He didn't want followers, and he left psychiatry very early. Then wrote a number of books in psychology and ended up as a philosopher. I'll give you a depiction of him so you see what he looked like. That's what he looked like. You see This must have been in his library. This is in his later years as a philosopher. His last criticism on psychoanalysis, which he vehemently criticized, was written in the 50s, 1950s, in the Netherlands. He was vehemently opposed to Freud as a psychologist. And so he maintained the interest in psychiatry. His second volume, he kept refining it and rewriting it, etc., etc. And although the first version really appeared in 1913, I believe. Yeah. So among others, I offer a separate lecture on Jaspers as well.
Did he explain why he left psychiatry?
Yes, I can explain it to you. He claimed to have a medical condition, a lung condition, and he said the workforce in the hospital was too hard on him. However, so I mean that's a given. He had a condition, but the fact remains he lived a long life. And he married a former nurse who also had a long life. But his life wasn't always easy during the war. And so he felt that he was at the Heidelberg Clinic. I sort of delved into this. He was at the Heidelberg Clinic at that time, which was a great incentive, which he says himself, even for his book, because he had some intellectuals around him, 4 or 5 people, who kept criticizing him, kept stimulating him, because he was quite a young man. He wrote that book before he was 13. He wrote that book in his 20s. It's just amazing, this man, because nobody did that before him, and yet he was not even 30 when he finished general psychopathology. So it's a bit of a genius to do that. And he said he couldn't have done it without the support, not only from his family, because he was quite independent, but also from his colleagues at the clinic. And he said the actual clinical work, the daily clinical practice, would tire him too much. And it may well be this way, because this way he was free to write, and free to observe, and free to so then, just recently, I wrote an old interview, just recently, from the archives, because he was interviewed why philosophy and so forth. He said, "Well, philosophy really freed him. Philosophy," he said, "is a real privilege to be a philosopher because you're freed of all this hospital chores and daily work chores at hospitals, and he felt free to write, and he said it was a real privilege to be a philosopher." When I teach Jaspers, I teach him as a clinician. Yet you'd find other people who have a congress or a conference on Jaspers just as a philosopher. It's rare that you have one person and 2 separate entities. But one we're just talking about Jaspers' philosophy, nothing else. And then there's others, and there's tons of literature about it, who talk about Jaspers as a clinician. I belong to the second group, obviously, but I can relate to the other one. But when I talk about philosophy, I'm fully aware that there are other philosophers too. But in terms of psychopathology, I'm not aware that somebody who wrote a book like his before 1930. So that was a cornerstone. That was a real cornerstone. And it's still fascinating today what he postulates about psychotherapy. Incredible. That we have to have ethical standards, that we have to be properly trained. All this you find in his book about psychotherapy, for example. All this in the Journal of Psychopathology. All right? You blir det en timme. You went to me. Me went to take a see. Me went to. Okay. See you just playing with the telephone. Okay. Then what I'm going to do next slide is rather interesting. I'll give you an overview. Okay. we're now concluding, more or less, and what I do after Jaspers, there's a big jump, because after Jaspers, we call this the Old Testament, then with Schneider sort of speak the New Testament, jokingly. Then there are many, many writings from many other people that are not included in this, otherwise we'll never finish. So basically, now I'm going to give you a summary, and you're fully aware that there have been many writings since the 60s. Modern, very modern writings, which you can easily access, but these are more difficult to access, what I just provided you, I imagine, including the photos, which I had to do a bit of research to find those photos. And then we get into the modern phase for a little bit, and that will be, let's see. Okay, so I'm going to do a jump from Jaspers, give you an overview, and then we sort of end up more in the modern times. Right? In between, there was this gentleman by the name of Kretschmer, with the personality types. That was in the 60s. Well, I felt that was so important that I included that. All right? Okay, here we go. And this, by no means, is complete. Yeah? I'm not claiming at all that this list is complete. It's a joint list because there's so much out there. All right? The romantic, we started out with that. Okay? The unitary psychosis, now, what could that be? Now, you wouldn't know. I can tell you, the unitary psychosis is a very modern concept. And who developed modern concepts early on? It was Griesinger. So it's fascinating that now this unitary psychosis, this is a modern concept that we're talking now about. What is this? Are we not going back to the unitary psychosis model? Now, but methodologically, epistemologically, this idea was first thought about by Griesinger in his writings. Maybe we're talking about the one thing. Maybe we're talking about the continuum spectrum. So this is past and present. Okay? Natural disease antithesis is, as you all know, Kraepelin. Groupus clinicus, as you know, is represented by Bleuler. Okay? Psychosis disorders of mental systems. Now we're talking about several. That's, we're getting into a number of people now, including Bleuler. Unconscious motives, obviously, among others, psychoanalysis, among others. Okay? And anthropological psychiatry, I haven't even talked about. That's a very interesting field. It used to be, one upon a time, it used to be during Freud times, there were a number of psychiatrists who took a great deal of interest in philosophy. And they called themselves the anthropological, a small group of anthropological psychiatrists. It does come in waves, and now it's not much talked about, but there were some prominent scientists following this. And the anthropology psychiatry, the word anthropology is very important anyway, because especially in psychotherapy, we need to know what we're doing. So we ask the question, what is your anthropology? What do you think man ought to be? And Rogers thinks quite differently, much more optimistic. If you ask the psychologists, psychotherapists, Freud is more pessimistic. Okay? And Jungian would be quite different again, and there are maybe 179 other psychotherapists out, and every 2 years you find 5 more at least. And you ask the question, what is their anthropology? What is their concept of man? And what should it be? And that question is frequently asked, or should be asked, in psychotherapy in particular, when you do interventions. What is really helpful is something international. Something like WHO. Because then you have so many cultures sitting together, And you don't have one dominate and say, oh, our anthropology, oh, it should be this way. Because then from the so-called, I say so-called developing world, people say, now, we've got totally different perspectives on things. We've got totally different problems. And so, unlike national systems, we're going to get to this at the end, a system like the ICD from WHO would be likely be more inclusive. Okay? So less at risk to dominate one anthropology, one anthropology to dominate that. Right? Shishi. Biological psychiatry is today's model. Okay? That has been our model now for a long time. Right? Consequently, we've got journals in biological psychiatry. The problem is, I'm talking personally, and the problem is this. Because there are more and more journals out there, and because our time is limited, people then read journals in biological psychiatry and don't read any others. So then you keep reading on biological psychiatry, and then your model is formed around one concept. And that is the big problem, you see. And this is when Jaspers came in and said, Jaspers said, I am going to look at the whole picture. I'm trying to look at the whole. I'm looking at the patient from a phenomenological perspective. That was Jaspers' feeling. And for him, psychoanalysis is just one aspect, one construct. And he was very critical about it, by the way. But, you see, if you're just stuck in one of these, you risk ignoring all the others. And that's a problem we live in today. There's so many different disciplines. You know. And personally, as a student, many decades ago, I was at different faculties and I began to suffer from the different languages. And I said, it seems to me as a student as though the epistemological vessel is destroyed. You know, the vessel, the unity, like a vessel, the epistemological vessel is like destroyed in bits and pieces. And those bits and pieces are getting more and more. So we need a unification theory. Ideally speaking, whether we'll get to this is just a hypothesis. Just personally speaking, just my unimportant personal views. All right? Go ahead, please.
You have less than 10 minutes.
Okay. Less than 10 minutes now. Let me just finish this page then. I think that's because that page is recognize that page is very important. Chinema? Huh? Okay, 谢谢. I always need a timer. Thanks for telling me.
Yes, I am.
Gestalt psychology, I don't explain. Structural dynamics. Denosalization. What does that mean? That's like we do away with classification. We don't need that. You know, because the patient doesn't care whether he has a bipolar disorder or whether he doesn't care. He just wants to get better. So this is all artificial what we're doing. So this is called denosalization. Nosology is another Greek word, by the way. And of course, this sits well with the anti-psychiatric movement. Now, I remember the anti-psychiatric movement was very strong in the 70s, even in the early 80s. It was very strong in some countries, really, really strong. You know, the name Cooper is one representative, and there were many others in different countries. In Italy, the whole hospitals there were closed from one day to another, and then people were just on the street. So it was just cognitive behavioral psychosis. We still have that going on now. It's very popular, as you know. Psychological, but very popular. System theory, neurotransmission, molecular psychiatry. All this is ongoing now. And don't forget genetics. Genetics is very strong here, even in Shanghai. Here at the psychiatry unit, I understand you do a lot of genetics research. Hayo Shanghai Institute. Just 2 examples. I mean, there are many more. Just talk about the situation in China. And that means a lot of money goes into it because genetic research is quite expensive. You know? And this is what social psychiatry argues. But we don't cost a lot of money. We only need manpower. You know, so if you will, there's the old social psychiatry versus the this new type of research, molecular psychiatry. What do you mean by post-structuralism? you know? Do you know the term? Of course you know. Can you give me a name associated with this topic? Sure. Levi Strauss， 还可以，有别的吗？不错。Levi Strauss 是 anthropology， Levi Strauss 这是好。But还有 more specifically, yeah, you're right. That would fit, but it doesn't fit in terms of psychiatry. There's that one person who's that's right. You see, Levi Strauss did anthropological work, and it would fit. But specifically, it's Foucault. But with Foucault, I'm not an expert at all. He never replied to my letter, so I'm not very endeared. Other people did, but Foucault never did. And he's controversial even to this day. You know, he passed away quite a few years ago. But Foucault did specifically study the psychiatry in France. You know, the birth, la naissance de la clinique, the birth of the clinic, and the punishment. He specifically, where Levi Strauss was an ethnologist, he studied that from an ethnology point of view. Yeah, so that would be that's. But I didn't put the name in. You see, no need to. You know it anyway. Yeah. All right. So I will conclude with this slide for the time being, and actually there isn't much more going on, but yeah, a little bit more than. Shensa, you went him up, you went him.
So where are we going now?
Where are we going now?
Yeah, I mean, in terms of this, of all those approaches.
我不知道，我也不知道。
你不知道？
我也不知道。你知道吗？
我不知道。
都不知道啊？我都不知道。
I thought would be the biology, the genetics. Don't you think?
Well, I said to you earlier, this is the model where we're in now. We're definitely not into this field. You never hear, but we're in this field now, where we've seen the psychoanalysis go down again, and the unconscious, and we're into these fields. We're definitely molecular psychiatry. We're in this field now. We're in genetics. I didn't have space to put down genetics. That's why I said I'm going to mention it to you. Otherwise, there would be genetics in there. System theory. No, we're into, and in psychology, we're into this model. Yeah, we're not into these. Yeah, we're in these fields we're now. Where we're going to be in the future. Is everyone's guess. As I mentioned before, my unimportant, unimportant personal concern is that we don't share our, shall we say, we don't communicate sufficiently. We don't share our experiences with other disciplines. I mean, do you really think that biology psychiatry is talking to, a post-structuralism unless he has private interest? He doesn't, because there's no time for this. It's a waste of time. Okay, and this is my concern. So it's this splitting, this epistemological splitting that I, as a student many decades ago, I was beginning to suffer actually. Because when you go to different faculties and you hear people different speak. I mean, Foucault, I wrote to him when I was still, I think I was still a student or about, when I was about, or in my late stage. And he was not taken seriously by clinicians at all. Now you can find some clinicians who are mentioning Foucault. But back in my days, in my student at the clinic, he couldn't. He was just a sociologist, or I mean, he just his theory. Now it's changed again. Now, in other words, that's my unimportant view. Is I'd like to see more of an integrative approach. But I'll get to this in a moment. Superficially.
Okay. Any questions, comments, folks? No, if not, we may have a break now. And the idea is, I suggest maybe we have a sort of 10 minutes break,
yeah,
according to this time, For those who are interested, please do come back and we can talk more sort of individually, tailoring what may interest you, and hopefully the discussion will continue to add depth to your work. To conclude this section, I'd just like to present you with this department coffee mug.
Thank you very much.
I don't know, I'm just thinking with the volume of your thinking, you need two things. You need a good brain, you got one already, but also good coffee or tea, I think.
Yes, and that just
maybe a good
vehicle.
vehicle.
Thank you very much.
Thank
So that's a nice little, oh, that's the important part. You're most welcome. And we're not quite finished yet.
Yeah.
When you come back, if you like, I've finished a few slides. It's only a few more.
Yeah.
And then if you like, or I interrupt for good, but if you like, you can finish a few slides, and then we open-ended.
And then open-ended, we talk for 10 minutes, 20 minutes, we finish early, etc.